Hi everyone, today I will be explaining the muscular system. In the very first part, you have some information. One of them is that stating that our muscular system constitute bulk of our body weight. Bulk, which means most of our body weight. Imagine about 1/3 of our body weight is the weight of muscles. Like if someone has the weight of 90 kilograms, 30 kilograms will be the weight of muscles. What do muscles do in general? Muscles can help our body to move. This is a function of skeletal muscles. They are attached to skeleton. They can provide us with different movements. It's not only about movement the body, but also they can move or push substances, okay, in the body. What substances? For example, there are smooth muscle lining the internal hollow organs like blood vessels, so they can push blood, or the smooth muscles found in the intestines, they can push food through. Or for example, there are cardiac muscles in the heart, they can pump blood. So they can play all these different roles, moving the body parts like trunk, like limbs, and also they can push substances like food and blood in internal organs. Okay. Students, there is a misconception. Like many students, when they hear the term of muscle, they think a muscle is like a tissue or maybe a cell, which is not. Whenever you hear the term of muscle, it means it's an organ. You're referring to an organ, because a single muscle is consist of various tissues, including muscle tissue. We already know that muscle tissue, they have the ability to contract and relax, unlike nervous and epithelial and connective tissue. But an organ must contain more than one type of tissue. So a muscle, it does not only consist of muscle tissue, but also blood vessels. And you already know, only in a blood vessel there is connective tissue, there is epithelial tissue. Also in a muscle there can be nerves, so nervous tissue and connective tissue. So all these different tissues can be found in one muscle, so a muscle can be considered as an organ. Here we have a diagram showing the skeletal muscle of a human from the anterior view and the posterior view, right? Try to know these terms as much as possible. Maybe they are not very important, but you will need some of them during the explanation. You should know their locations. One of them is the deltoid muscle that is located at the very top of the shoulder. You are going to study the structure of the skeletal muscle using the deltoid muscle as a model, and also the tricep and bicep muscles they're very important. We are going to cover them in the upcoming contents. Types of muscles. There are 3 types of muscles, as we have already studied in section 1: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, depending on where are they located and the role they can play in our body. I have developed a table that summarizes a comparison between the 3 types of muscles. So let's go like point by point. Skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, its function, since it's skeletal muscle, it's attached to the skeleton, so its function will be moving body parts, including limbs, trunk, and face. I think the function is very clear. The same for smooth muscle, since they are found in the internal organs, they line the cavities of internal organs, including blood vessels, intestines, and other internal organs. Of course, their function will be pushing food and blood through these organs. Cardiac muscle, they are found in the wall of the heart. That's why they are called cardiac. Cardiac means heart. Their function will be pumping blood, of course. Concerning their shape, the skeletal muscle and cardiac muscles are both elongated. If you just take a look at their shapes, the above diagrams, you can see that these muscles, these two types of muscles, are elongated. But the cardiac muscle is shorter than the skeletal muscle, like in length, but both of them are elongated in shape. While the smooth muscle is spindle in shape or spindle shaped. What does spindle mean? Spindle is something like this. You know, when our grandmothers were, they were using the sheep wool and they were making strings out of them using this spindle. So this is the meaning of spindle shape. Even if you take a look at the figure, maybe you can figure that out, that they are kind of spindle, like cells are spindle shaped, like they are pointed at the two ends and swollen in the middle. What else? Number 3, the skeletal muscle is multinucleated. You can see on the figure above, like this is like one cell. You can see more than one nucleus. You see the dark dots? They are the nuclei. So it's multinucleated. It contains many nuclei. While, on the other hand, smooth muscles and cardiac muscles are having a single nucleus. They have a single nucleus in their cells. What else? The skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle, they do share another characteristic. Both of them, they are not forming sheets. They do not form sheets. Maybe they can form bundles, but not sheets. While the smooth muscle, since it aligns the cavities of internal organs and body cavities, so it can make sheets, usually thin layers like sheets of muscle cells, smooth muscle cells, right? In case of striation, you should know what the striation means, students. Striation, like for example, zebra. Zebra is a striated animal because having strips on its coat, like light and dark. So whenever there's something having light and dark regions alternating, that appearance is called striated. So if you take a look at their figures, you can see the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle, both of them are striated. They have like light and dark bonds, but you have to close the figures a little bit. You can see there are striations, so there are like light and dark bonds. The appearance of striations or light and dark bonds, it is because of the arrangement of protein fibers that we are going to cover them soon in the next contents. They give the dark and light alternating pattern or striated appearance. So to recap, the cardiac and the skeletal muscle, both of them are striated, while the smooth muscle, they lack striations. What else? The skeletal muscle, they form tendons. Since they are attached to the skeleton, to the bone, so they need junctions. They need something to connect them with bones. That's why the connective tissue that's found in skeletal muscle organ, the connective tissue combine to form tendons. But in case of smooth and cardiac muscles, they do not combine to form tendons, or does not. So no tendons. This has come in the general examinations. The very last difference is that the skeletal muscle, we can control the muscles that are attached to our bones at will or consciously. So that's why they are said to be voluntary. While the cardiac and the smooth muscles are involuntary. We cannot control the movement at all. Then we did explain this part, and concerning fascicles, you are going to cover that on a diagram because it's a structure and you cannot get it just from a text. And these diagrams or figures, they are in your book. They are for the skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscles. So let's scroll down to see what comes next. Okay. I'm not going to explain anything on the structure of skeletal muscle unless we use a figure. So I will be giving you the other background information. The connective tissue that's found in a muscle, its role is support and reinforcement. So supporting muscle fibers and reinforcement of the muscle as a whole. That's the role of connective tissue in a muscle organ. Okay? The other point states that the health of a muscle depends on sufficient what? Nerve and blood supply. It's very important for a muscle to be stimulated by nerves and to transmit sensory information through sensory neurons, and also to have a sufficient blood circulation, because the blood will supply muscle cells with oxygen and nutrients and will remove away CO2 and metabolic wastes. So it's very important for muscles to be provided with nerves and blood supply. And when a muscle is supplied with nutrients and oxygen, they can also produce energy, and they need that energy for the process of contraction and relaxation. Okay. So now we have the structure of a skeletal muscle. Students, you just focus with me. Okay. So we are going to study the structure of a skeletal muscle using a muscle called deltoid, which is located on the top of our shoulders. So this is a deltoid muscle. So this level is organ. When we call it muscle, it means it's an organ. A muscle is an organ. So a muscle organ consists of what? If you just magnify a muscle organ or one muscle organ, you can see that it's like a bundle of structures called fascicles. It's like a bundle of structures called fascicles. So fascicle is the second level. Then if you magnify each fascicle, as you can see here, this is a fascicle, like this is all is one fascicle. You can see one fascicle is made up of a bundle of smaller structures or bands called what? Muscle fibers. Each is called muscle fiber. And muscle fiber is what we call it muscle cell. Muscle fiber is the same as muscle cell. This is a level of cell. Then each muscle fiber, if you can see, you magnify, they have smaller bundles. And each one of this bundle, okay, is made up of segments and protein filaments. These protein filaments are called actin and myosin. The thick filaments, the yellow thick filaments are myosin, and the thin red filaments are actin. They are protein filaments. These protein filaments, they are arranged in a way they give light and dark regions on the muscle myofibril, okay, or muscle fibril. So the muscle fibril consists of two types of proteins, myosin and actin. Now we can call myofibril to be the fourth level of organization in a muscle. So every single muscle cell consists of a bundle of little structures or smaller units called myofibril. What does myo mean? Myo from Latin means muscle, and fibril, it means little fibers, like organ, organelle, nucleus, nucleolus, fiber, fibril. So myofibril means little fibers. These little fibers are made up of filaments, as we mentioned, called actin and myosin, so we can call them protein fibers. Okay, so this is a structure or a general structure for a skeletal muscle. If we make like a diagram, which muscle structure is the largest? Of course, a muscle organ or a muscle. Then a muscle is made up of a bundle of smaller structures called fascicles. Then each fascicle is made up of smaller units called muscle fibers or cells. Then muscle fibers are composed of a bundle of smaller units called myofibril, and myofibril are consist of two types of filaments called actin and myosin. Alright. If we zoom in a structure of myofibril, now students, the diagram that you have, okay, I mean this one, is a structure of myofibril. You see there are three main parts. You see this pink pillars, they are called Z-line. Why Z-line? Because if you focus on the previous figure, see how do they look like? See they look like Z, zigzag, Z-line, they are called Z-line. So the unit between Z-line and Z-line is called sarcomere. Sarcomere, like the part of the myofibril that's located between two Z-lines is called sarcomere. And sarcomere is the smallest functional unit in muscle. The smallest functional unit, or the smallest unit in muscle that has the ability to contract and relax. And that's why we will study the process of muscle contraction at this level, the level of sarcomere. So now this one, all this together is what is a sarcomere. Sarcomere. So a sarcomere is located between two Z-lines, and attached to these Z-lines are red filaments, thin red filaments called actin. The red filaments are called actin. And then there are, in between these actin filaments, are thicker yellow filaments called myosin. So if we make a comparison between actin and myosin, we can see first actin filament, students, if you focus, they are attached to Z-line. The red ones are attached to the Z-line at one end. But myosin filaments are not attached, see? Myosin filaments are free in the middle. The other difference is that actin filaments are thinner, while myosin are thicker. And actin filaments, they don't have heads, they don't have branches. But myosin filaments, they do. See where I am labeling? These are the heads. These are the heads. So they are called the myosin heads, oval heads. While actin filament, they don't have heads, they just like strands of beads. They look like strands of beads, like beads. Now let's see how does a muscle, or a skeletal muscle to be more exact, contracts. First of all, we did mention earlier that in order for a muscle to contract, a nervous stimulus is needed. So what? A nerve supply is needed. So there are nerve endings that stimulate muscle fibers. And let's not forget, all sarcomeres, all myofibrils within a muscle fiber, they contract together simultaneously at the same time. They contract together, they relax together, so they work together. So they are all stimulated together. So after a muscle fiber is stimulated, its sarcomeres will start to undergo the process of contraction. Let's see how does that work. Okay. You remember the name of the structure, the Z line, the myosin heads, the actin filaments. But before we begin the process, you focus on the sarcomere. Okay? You focus on the sarcomere. You see this part is light, it's yellowish. But this part is red, is dark. This part again is red. Maybe in another sarcomere there's a light bond again. So you see light, dark, dark. So dark light, dark light, dark light. This alternating pattern of light, dark bands in a sarcomere of skeletal muscle, it's what gives the skeletal muscle a striated appearance. You remember the striations that we mentioned earlier? Like light and dark pattern of appearance. So it comes from this, the distribution of actin and myosin filaments. Alright, so let's see how does a skeletal muscle contract. Now in the very first phase here, this muscle is in a relaxed state. You see there is a space, a gap between the actin filaments. They are not overlapping each other. Okay, what happens in the very first step? You remember the myosin heads, those pointed branches? In the very first step, they attach to actin filaments. So the very first step is that myosin heads attach to actin filaments. Then they bend inward. You see what happens? See, at first they look like they're like this, and then in this step what happened to the heads? They are straightened, and then now they bend inward. Why bend inward? They bend inward in order to pull the muscle. You know, it's just like, let's assume that you have fallen in a well, in a, let's say, in a deep hole, and somebody is trying to help you, like throwing a rope, and you are trying to pull that rope in order to get out of that hole. So what are you doing? You are using your arms, right? You're pulling the rope step by step, moving your hands one step like ahead of the rope in order to climb the wall of the hole and to get out of that hole. So it's something very similar to that. So the myosin heads are just like your limbs, your hands, and the myosin heads are pulling the actin filaments. So when they bend inward, this causes the actin filaments to pull. Now I just want you students to focus on the distance that I am going to point. Now here let's assume this distance is 1 micrometer. For example, this one could be 0.3 micrometer. See, the distance is decreased. I'm talking about the distance between actin filaments, the red ones. So here the muscles start to contract. It's contracting, but the process of contraction is not completed. Or in other words, the skeletal muscle is not fully contracted yet. This is the second step. In the third phase, see, a muscle is fully contracted when the actin filaments are overlapped. They have a thick zone of overlapping. What caused them to overlap? We said in the second step they are not overlapped completely, but why in the third step they are overlapped completely? It's because the myosin heads, they will release in step 2 after they have let's say pulled the actin filaments. They will get released. They will release the actin filaments again, and they will go back to their original place where they first let's say the position where they first attached to the actin filaments. Then they will start to pull actin filaments one more step, and this what causes overlapping of the actin filaments in when a muscle contracts, and this will cause the whole muscle to shorten. Now the sarcomere is shortened, has decreased in length. Now the muscle is fully contracted, but will it stay contracted like forever? Of course not. After every muscle contraction, a muscle relaxation must follow. What causes a muscle to relax? For a muscle to relax, remember this, ATP is needed, students. ATP is needed in order for a muscle to relax. Why ATP is needed? ATP is needed for the detachment of myosin heads, these myosin heads, okay, see where I'm pointing, myosin heads from actin filaments. So the detachment, not attachment, which means releasing. ATP is needed for myosin heads to release actin filaments, and when they are released, they will go back to their original state as in the first step, okay, and so the muscle will relax again. Hope the process was clear. The explanation is the same thing, you just need to understand the figure, how does it work. So energy is needed, as we mentioned. Why energy is needed? In order for the myosin heads to what? To detach. Here it's mentioned, to detach. Detachment of the myosin heads from actin filaments. So ATP is needed for this step to happen. And we already mentioned that the process is all or none response. Like either all the myofibrils, all the sarcomeres will contract, or all of them will relax it, so they work together. That's what I mean. There is one more thing, students. How do we know how much force is needed to do a work? Or like, for example, when you are lifting a pen and when you are lifting a dumbbell, for a dumbbell you are using a greater force. Your muscles are exerting a greater force. What determines the amount of force? This is a very important question and has already come in the general examinations. The force of muscle contraction is determined by what? It's determined by the number of muscle fibers that are stimulated by the nervous system. The more muscle fibers are stimulated, in other words, the more muscle cells are stimulated, the greater force is produced. Yeah? So depending on the number of muscle fibers or muscle cells that are stimulated. Now let's see, how does a skeletal muscle moves bones? Alright, first of all, let's remember these two structures, tendon and ligament. You must remember them. Tendon, if you remember the definition of tendon, which is a connective tissue connecting muscle to bone. You see, this is a tendon. See how does a tendon is connecting this muscle to this bone, right? While ligament is connecting bone to bone. You see, this is a ligament. It's connecting this bone to this bone. This is first. Second, you should know that there are two types of muscles depending on the way they move joints. One of them is called flexor, the other is called extensor. Let's see what's the difference between flexor and extensor. First of all, you should know the meaning of flexor and extensor. Flexor means, students, it means bend. Flex means bend. Flexion means bending. You know what does bend mean? So flexor, it is a type of muscle that when it contracts, it will bend a joint. So it causes what? Bend of a joint. For example, this muscle is called biceps. When biceps muscle contracts, what happens to your elbow joint? It will bend, right? Bending the bone. So when the joint bends, the muscle that bends the joint, let's say in this way, that muscle is called flexor. In other words, the muscle that flexes a joint is called flexor. But the muscle, for example, like this one, which is called triceps. When triceps contract, okay, your arm will start to straighten. So the extensor muscle, we have another figure, you see. For example, in this case, students, this one is tricep, this muscle. When tricep muscle contracts, see, the elbow joint will straighten. That's why the triceps is called what? Extensor. It's not a flexor because it's extending your joint, the elbow joint in this case. So there are two types of muscle: flexor muscle, the muscle that flexes a joint or bending the joint, but extensor muscle is a muscle that causes extension or the straightening of the joint. One more thing. There is something called origin and insertion. Origin and insertion of muscle. Every single skeletal muscle, students, has two ends, right? And each end is attached to a different bone. Okay. Now let's use, okay, just give me a second. So let's use the biceps muscle as an example. So this is a biceps muscle. The biceps muscle, as you can see, is attached to two different bones through tendons. The white connective tissue is the tendon, right? It's what connects muscle to bones. So this biceps muscle is attached to two different bones. This bone is called scapula, if you remember the name of bones from the skeletal system. And this bone is called radius. What is the difference between scapula and radius? I'm not talking about their shape. I'm talking about if they are capable of any movement or not. The scapula is kind of stationary. It's kind of fixed bone. It doesn't really move. But radius is a highly movable bone. So now you got the name of these two bones. The point is, what does origin and insertion mean? Origin, you just focus on where I am pointing. Origin, students, is a point, okay, where, okay, let me just delete this to make it more clear. The point at which a skeletal muscle is attached to a bone, a stationary bone, that point is called origin of that muscle. So in this case, it will be the origin of biceps. And the point where a skeletal muscle is attached to a movable joint, like as in this case, the radius bone, a movable bone, not a movable joint, sorry. So that will be called the insertion point. Again, the point where a skeletal muscle is attached to a stationary bone, that point is called origin. But the point where the skeletal muscle is attached to a movable bone, like radius, that point is referred to as insertion. Insertion and origin. Okay, I hope everything is clear. These are the figures that you have in the book, but I use the other one because the other one was more, it was more understandable, to be honest. Opposing pairs. There is something called opposing pairs or antagonistic pairs. Antagonistic pairs. What's agonistic, or what does opposing pair mean? Again, if we go back to our example, tricep biceps muscle. So this one is triceps and this one is biceps. Okay, so when your biceps muscle, I hope you give it a try when you are listening to me. When just try to contract your biceps muscle. See where biceps muscle is located? Contract it. What happened to your elbow joint? Your elbow joint is flexed. It's bent, right? Your arm is bent, just as in the figure. Like in this case, the figure that you see, biceps is contracted. But if we go to the other figure, for example, this figure, okay, you see the arm is straightened. In this case, which muscle is contracted? The triceps muscle is contracted. The point is, students, whenever in an opposing pair of muscles, when one muscle in the pair contracts, the other muscle in the same pair relaxes. So for example, in this case, as we mentioned earlier, okay, in this case the biceps muscle is contracted, but at the same time the triceps muscle is relaxed. But in the other figure, this one, the triceps muscle is contracted, the biceps muscle is relaxed. You see? They work in opposing pairs, like oppositely, alternatively. When one contracts, the other relaxes, and so on. One more point, note that should be taken in consideration is that muscles can make a work when they contract, okay? And when they contract, how do they move bones? Through pulling them, not pushing them, okay? Keep this in mind. Muscles or a skeletal muscle can move a bone by pulling them, not pushing it. Okay, the very last part of this section, student, is what's called muscle fatigue. Okay, I believe you all have undergone this condition when your muscle develop cramps, pain, soreness, right? Okay, so let's just go back to some background information. This is a skeletal muscle, spindle shaped. Okay. Normally, the blood vessels will supply our muscles with what? With glucose. So the orange dots representing glucose. And the respiratory system will provide blood vessels with oxygen. Okay. So normally, the glucose and oxygen in our muscles, they undergo the process of aerobic respiration, producing 38 ATP. This is through aerobic. This is normally. This ATP is needed for the process of relaxation to happen. You remember we said ATP is needed for myosin heads to detach from actin filaments in order for the muscle to return back to the relaxed state, right? Okay. Sometimes this ATP is not produced in sufficient amounts, and we will come to the reason. But let's just say that when there is no or not enough ATP, what will happen? This will lead to a condition called muscle fatigue. Muscle fatigue. Why is that? Because ATP is needed for the detachment of myosin heads from actin filaments in a contracted skeletal muscle. So a contracted skeletal muscle, in other words, needs ATP to relax. When there is no ATP, no relaxation. So what will happen? The skeletal muscle will stay contracted, and that's what we call it cramps, muscle cramps. Okay, but why ATP is not produced sufficiently? Why does ATP death or depletion happen, which can lead to muscle fatigue? There must be a cause for ATP depletion, right? Normally we said glucose, oxygen, when they are supplied to the muscle, aerobic respiration will produce sufficient ATP. But sometimes when someone is doing strenuous exercises, or let's say hard work, okay, at this point the amount of oxygen that is delivered to the muscle, okay, is less than the amount of oxygen that is used in the process of aerobic respiration. In other words, metabolism of glucose increases, aerobic respiration rate increases, while the amount of oxygen that's delivered is still not enough. It cannot meet the energy, let's say, production. Okay, now so far so good. Oxygen depletion, when it's not supplied enough in sufficient amounts that can meet the demand of ATP production, what will happen? ATP production will decrease. But why? Because you remember from grade 11, in case if there is no sufficient oxygen, the glucose instead of aerobic will take the anaerobic pathway. And in human, lactic acid fermentation. And lactic acid fermentation will result in the production of lactic acid. Accumulation of lactic acid in skeletal muscles will cause pain and soreness. And that's what really happens. Okay? So when oxygen is not enough in the skeletal muscles, when oxygen is not meeting the demand for ATP production, of course the amount of ATP is decreased, because the glucose, in the absence of oxygen, will take the anaerobic pathway, and in anaerobic pathway, if you remember, only 2 ATP are produced. So less ATP, and the muscle will stay contracted, no detachment, so eventually cramps and pain. But a person who is running, who is doing strenuous exercises, will start to breathe rapidly and have deep breathing, because in order to increase the rate of oxygen supply. But even that, it may not meet the amount of oxygen that's needed to provide enough ATP through aerobic respiration. Okay, that's why sometimes when cramps develop, and then you will need some rest, maybe for 1-2 days, 3 days, in order for the cramps to repair. And what causes repairment is that the lactic acid that's produced in your muscles when you take rest, and when your muscles get oxygen, again enough oxygen, the lactic acid will flow through blood vessel into the liver, and inside the liver it will undergo metabolism, neutralization, so the acidity in your muscles is decreased now, and the pain is relieved. So we can conclude that muscle fatigue is caused by ATP reduction, and ATP reduction is caused by oxygen depletion or oxygen debt. It's sometimes called oxygen debt, students. So normally glucose produces 38 ATP molecules through aerobic respiration, but during oxygen debt, glucose will undergo anaerobic, producing lactic acid in muscles. This is a muscle cell. And then when conditions get normal, lactic acid will flow to the blood and then to the liver. It will undergo metabolism. Neutralization will happen to this acidity. Okay, I hope the contents were clear. What's left are the section review questions. Most of them are already mentioned their answers. See, they are all in the contents. We have explained them all. For example, question 1, 3 types of muscles. Compare, you have the schedule. Question 2, why muscle is called involuntary? Because the muscle that we cannot, like smooth muscle that we cannot control their movement, that will be involuntary. What does striated mean, or why does skeletal muscle appear striated? We already mentioned it's all because of the arrangement of actin and myosin filaments that produce dark and light bands in sarcomere, which gives striated appearance. How does skeletal muscle contract? We already mentioned the whole process. How does skeletal muscle work together to move bones? They work in opposing pairs. When one muscle contracts, the other relaxes. And what's the difference between flexor extensor? Flexor flexes the joint or bending the joint. Extensor muscle extend the joint. What causes muscle to become fatigued? We just mentioned it. The last question that maybe it's new for you, rigor mortis. Rigor mortis, students, is a condition that shortly happen after death. Maybe the dead person will have contracted muscles, develop contracted muscles. This is called rigor mortis. This happens because when a person dies, the heart will fall to beat again, pumping blood. So when the blood is not pumped to the muscles, means the oxygen is not supplied. So no ATP production, no detachment, no ATP, no detachment of the myosin head from actin filaments. So no relaxation. The muscle will stay contracted, and this condition is called rigor mortis. All right. Students, please, if you have any question, you can put it in the comment of this video, and do not forget to subscribe my YouTube channel so that you can get more video, and you can get benefit from one another. So I think that's it. Now we can call it a day. This unit or this chapter is covered completely, the 3 sections in 3 videos, and I will try to make a video for all the chapter review questions, and the questions of workbook, and the questions of teacher assessment guide, and also the general examination questions. I will try to do my best and record a video for that. Thank you so much for your listening. Take care of yourself, and good luck. Bye bye.